Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Collision. Daniel here to talk about the new Garfield movie. I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So, unless my math is just terrible, which hey, happens more often than I would like, it seems like it's been nearly 20 years since everyone's favorite lasagna-loving feline, graced the silver Hollywood screen. But Garfield is back, to try and prove that he still has several of his cat lives left. And I think like Jim Davis's classic comic strips are beloved by many. I grew up with Garfield, the comics, and also the TV specials, but it seems like the character has struggled to sort of reestablish himself for a younger generation. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that this new Garfield movie will do a whole lot to change that. And parents, as such as myself, will, I think, appreciate the fact that there is a lack of like problematic, kind of questionable content included. But this movie does demonstrate that just a lack of like bad content doesn't always equal a good movie. And I think despite some fun moments, the Garfield movie is a mostly forgettable and kind of directionless story that fails to honor its iconic character. And they say that a cat always lands on its feet, but the Garfield movie struggles to find any firm footing. The movie is directed by Mark Dingdall, who helmed, I think, objectively the greatest animated movie ever made in These Emperor's New Groove. And whereas that movie, I think, was elevated by a very confident and distinctive tone, the Garfield movie lacks kind of a similarly clear vision. And I think the biggest problem, at least to me, is that it doesn't always feel like a Garfield movie at all. And instead, it comes across more like just a generic animated adventure, perhaps like an unused story idea for another Secret Life of Pets movie that kind of only later had the Garfield, IP sort of cloaked on top of it, for the sake of marketability. And there are some kind of scattered moments that do capture the characters, kind of famous sarcasm and wit, particularly in, anytime that the character sort of breaks the fourth wall and, speaks directly to the audience. But it just seems like the decision to send this very, domesticated feline onto a very convoluted, high stakes adventure heist just feels very misguided. And stripped of many of his sort of defining characteristics and qualities, Garfield simply isn't as interesting or compelling of a character, and he is voiced by Chris Pratt, who, hey, I like Chris Pratt, and it seems like somehow he's just sort of become the go-to guy to voice all these, characters in animated films. And as with his performance in a Super Mario movie, which is a movie that I actually enjoyed quite a bit, in Garfield, it does come across a lot like just Chris Pratt's voice coming out of an animated character, rather than infusing that character with a lot of, unique charm or characteristics. I think it definitely looks like Garfield on screen, but it just rarely do you get the sense of kind of the, the spirit of Garfield inside. But before I just, get accused of being, as grumpy as Garfield and only, nitpicking this movie, I think despite its faults, the Garfield movie is not without some charm. Like all cats, Garfield is not always the most sentimental or affectionate character, but this movie is almost surprisingly sweet and emotional at times, such as a very adorable origin story to his relationship with John. And kind of historically, Garfield, with his very laid back demeanor and dry delivery, has never been an overly zany or wacky or just laugh out loud character. And because of that, a lot of the more successful, laugh out loud in the theater type gags do come from more the less traditional, the physical comedy. Because there are some good sequences in this. There's an elaborate training sequence, which I know, my own 9-year-old kids enjoyed quite a bit, or a scene which has been featured a lot in the trailers, where he's kind of unsuccessfully trying to board a moving train. And at least to me, these jokes felt more like they would belong better in a Kung Fu Panda movie rather than a Garfield movie, but they are no less amusing. On the other hand, the Garfield movie is less, apt at capturing the character's signature wit and quips. And hey, perhaps some of this is just that, a character created in the 1970s doesn't always translate as directly to today, but it does seem like a movie that is trying to reestablish the character for a younger generation, that many of its sort of jokes seem like they're aimed more at adults than at kids. For example, there's a climactic scene where, a swarm of fast food delivery drones arrive, and, their silhouettes are shown framed against, the sun, which is a clear visual homage to, this film Apocalypse Now. And the soundtrack that's playing during this is, the Top Gun soundtrack. And Garfield makes even a quip at the time, that he does all his own stunts. He says, me and Tom Cruise. And really none of those attempts at comedy will likely resonate at all with, anyone under the age of like 16. All that being said, speaking as a parent, I know for many other parents, whether a movie is like bad quality wise is not always as important these days. It's just whether it's like, bad content wise. And during a time when like taking your kids can feel like you have to like hold your breath and just sort of hope to navigate the minefield of, just mature content or agendas or messages, the Garfield movie is about as clean as they come. There is no language or sexual themes or just other elements or messages that you're gonna have to like unteach on the way home. I think it might not always be the most entertaining family film, but it does at least appear that its primary purpose is to entertain families and nothing more. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, like I just said, there really isn't a whole lot here. As far as language, there's no profanity, although there are a few like, profanity adjacent kind of filler words like, dang or dang it, but nothing beyond that. Violence, nothing really here either. There's some kind of cartoonish violence of, characters smashing into walls or falling over, but again, nothing that should be unexpected or concerning. As far as sexuality, only a few minor things here. There's a scene where kind of two romantically involved animals are kind of finally reunited at the end of this movie, and during that scene, kind of Marvin Gaye's famous song "Let's Get It On" starts to like play in the background, and then they kind of pounce on each other, and the scene cuts. And the only other thing that might raise some eyebrows for parents is kind of at the end of this movie. A lot of these animals are with John, and they're in a restaurant, and they're kind of disguised as humans in order to eat at the table. And Odie, who is a male dog, is clearly dressed as, a girl. Is like a very, prominent pink bow. Again, I took it as this sort of a harmless thing, but it's just one thing to note. Maybe the last sort of content thing is just that milk, kind of in several scenes, is depicted in ways that is clearly meant to like, invoke wine or other kind of like alcoholic beverages. As far as themes and kind of things going on beneath the surface of this film, there's nothing particularly deep about the themes and messages in the Garfield movie, although that doesn't mean that the messages aren't wholesome or important. And really, like the central theme in this film is just about our like fundamental need for relationships, because almost every character in this movie, whether it's a human or a cat or some other kind of anthropomorphic animal, is driven by kind of the sense of loneliness and a desire to find belonging. Because John, he's a single man that, at least at the start of this film, doesn't have anyone to kind of share, life with. Whereas Garfield, is dealing with a lot of hurt and pain from kind of memories of, what he feels like he was seemingly abandoned by his father when he was a kitten. And even Jinx, who's like the, the villainous feline in this film, sort of her whole, agenda is driven by revenge towards those that she feels deserted her when she needed them most. And the way that this film, navigates those themes is very wholesome, where in some cases, sort of finding that companionship is discovered by working out differences and grudges, among family, such as Garfield and his estranged father, who is voiced by Samuel L. Jackson. And kind of there's a repeated motif all throughout that, just a family showing up for family, that family might not always agree with each other or understand each other, but they can still be present and supportive. And for many of the other characters, sort of this sense of belonging comes more from like found family rather than biological family, where they kind of learn to align their life, alongside other people in a very like mutually beneficial and enriching relationships. And as a Christian, we know that the Bible affirms, the important role both of literal and metaphorical families. Whenever the biblical authors speak about the church, it is often in the language of, family and belonging to the household of God as children of God. So there's definitely some themes in here that I think as Christians we can affirm and kind of use to talk with our kids about. So in the end, I think kids that didn't grow up with, the character of Garfield are unlikely to really care if it stays true to the classic spirit of the character. I think they simply want to be entertained. And I do think in that regard, the Garfield movie does offer some very mild and like inoffensive entertainment. Still, I think what could have been a very like loving ode to an iconic character instead just feels oddly like detached and corporate. And it's even ironic that kind of despite another of the underlying themes in this which is this kind of speaking out against commercialization, this movie is just bursting with probably more more product placement than I can remember in any movie that I've seen in the last year. And as a result, this is a family film that I just don't think ever reaches its full potential, and this kind of comes across almost as like empty and hollow as a fridge after Garfield finishes his midnight snack. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. If you go see this or if you take your kids, jump into the comment section. Let me hear what you thought of it, if you enjoyed it, if you didn't enjoy it. And I encourage you guys too, if you haven't done so, subscribe to the channel, Become a Collider. Lots of movie reviews and a podcast and interviews and other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.